Welcome to Stories from the Park, a Heritage Park podcast. Hi, I'm Kesia Quill, Chief Curator.
And I'm Dominic Terry, Communications Manager here at Heritage Park.
We are located on Treaty 7 land in Calgary, Alberta, a place where visitors come to learn about the history of all those who have gathered here, and where Indigenous people proudly share cultural traditions and tell stories about their rich heritage, history, and attachment to the land.
In this episode, we're exploring more stories of Black history in Alberta, where people came from, where they settled, and what they did for employment, as well as the discrimination they faced.
Our guest is Deborah Beaver, the great-granddaughter of settlers who settled in Campsie, near Barrhead, and is a co-founder of the Black Settlers of Alberta and a Saskatchewan Historical Society.
Hi, Deborah. Thanks for doing this. We really appreciate you coming and having a chat with us about a very important month on the calendar and celebrate something that we celebrate in different ways all around the year, but Black History Month. Thanks for coming and talk to us about the history of the Black community in Alberta and more over the prairies.
Well, thank you for asking me to join you.
Well, we love to learn from all sorts of different people because everyone brings in a different perspective and more information. So we're gonna look at the broader context and see if you could tell us a bit more about where some of these earlier Black immigrants to Canada were coming from and why they were leaving where they were coming from.
I guess I could talk mostly about my family, but I think the majority, or a lot of them, it seems in talking to other people, like my family, on my paternal grandmother's side, they came from Alabama, but then they left Alabama. They made their way to Texas because things in Alabama weren't good. So they made their way to Texas, and I don't know, something went wrong in Texas. So then, that was before when Oklahoma when it was a free state. Many of the Black people from the southern states went to Oklahoma.
Right.
And then when Jim Crow laws and things started to happen in Oklahoma, that's when many of them chose to leave the U.S. and make their way to Canada. Now, like, as I said, my paternal grandfather, they're from Alabama. My paternal grandfather, they're from the Carolinas. A lot of these people, like, they came from Missouri, a lot of the southern states, Texas, but mostly the southern states, and then they made their way up. And the reason that they left was the racism and the way they were being treated in the States. And the other thing is, at that time, that's when Canada, they were advertising for people to come. They had advertisements and in the newspapers and things, and people were seeing these ads. So that's how they ended up heading up this way as well, because they were advertising for people to come and offering them land for $10 for, I think, 100 acres or something like that. It was cheap.
Is that a kind of a trail that people would have taken, do you think, out of those eastern states at the time to go west and then try to find their way up to Oklahoma as things kind of followed them along and then kind of made their way into Canada?
Yeah, they kind of made their way into Canada. And I know, like, one of the settlements, I don't know if it was that way for all of them, but how they communicated back then, when you think about it now. But I know up by Amber Valley, near Athabasca, they actually had people that they came up ahead. There were some men that came, a group of men that came and looked, on land, and then somehow sent word back, or I don't know if they went back or sent word back to say, okay. So then there was when there was groups of them that came to one of the different parts of Alberta. But yeah, I think the trail was mostly because they were leaving and Oklahoma was a free state. And then when they got to Oklahoma, they were treated badly. They couldn't vote. There were so many things that they couldn't do. And as I said, Canada was advertising. So
that's one of the big things that led them here was that advertisement of, hey, come.
Yeah.
So was there like a way that they decided where they wanted to go in Canada? Was it just
Well,
someone went ahead and they
well, as I said, Canada was advertising,
hmm
and Alberta, and Alberta wasn't a province yet.
Right.
Canada had barely. This would have been, well, the major immigration, as far as I know, was between, say, 1905 and 1911.
Right.
And actually there was only about between 13 and 1800 people that actually were part of that immigration.
Mhm.
And then the government said, okay, we don't want any more of you guys here.
Mm.
We don't want any more. So that was I mean, in terms of that was a small group of Black people, but it didn't
Yeah.
take too many for them to say, we don't want you. And I mean, I actually have this was in what was it? August 15th, 1911, where um there was a period of time where they basically said that they didn't want immigrants belonging to the Negro race,
Mm.
which is a race deemed unsuitable to the climate and requirements of Canada. And this was it was in the government house at Ottawa. So they cut them off. So
Wow.
that
But
and
up until then, was it fairly welcoming? Did they were they, I guess, not so much welcome with open arms, but almost tolerated for a while until word got back to Ottawa that, hey, this is, we don't like this.
well, I mean, I think, like I said, 1800, that's not very many people.
No.
That's a small amount. Um, and they also had very like to get here, you had to have a certain amount of money. They had very strict medical requirements.
hmm
They had to pass. They came with all of their equipment and in many cases, their livestock. They came with food. They had to prove that they could sustain themselves for a certain period of time.
Right. So were most of them coming to farm or did they come for other opportunities?
Most of those people were
Mhm.
pretty much farmers because they settled in four rural areas
Yeah.
in Alberta. And I don't know that much about, like, once they got here, there was the immigration hall in Edmonton. So they would have all eventually had to come through immigration hall. Now, when they came on the train,
Mhm.
and the majority of them came through Emerson, Manitoba. So that was the border
That's when they got
crossing
off.
that
Okay.
they had to make it to. And then I'm not sure how they got, well, I guess train, and they had horses and oxen and to get here to Edmonton. And then um, I haven't done any research to know when they got to Immigration Hall how this land was given to them.
Right.
Or did they actually get a map and get to pick their homestead, or was it assigned to them? But I do know that the majority, well, of the set of the land that they got, it was rural. It was rural, and very heavily dense trees, and
Mm.
like they had to literally um, to get to their places, they had to cut down trees to even get to make a road into where they were going to live, and then cut down trees to build their whatever they lived in, lean-tos and stuff, until they could build their house. Now, I
Wow.
think there were some guidelines too as to how long. It seems to me I heard 3 years or something for them to build
Yep.
some kind of a house structure.
Yep.
And and so those were all farmers, and they settled in, well, Amber Valley, which was is up near Athabasca,
hmm
and then Breton
hmm
and Wildwood
Okay.
and Campsie.
Okay.
So those were the four rural settlements.
Okay.
There were some people that came um, that didn't actually end up going to the country. There's some that ended up staying in Edmonton, and there's some that went to the country and it didn't work, so
Mm,
they came back and stayed in Edmonton. And there was also a settlement in Maidstone, Saskatchewan.
right. Right.
Why Edmonton? Why not Calgary? Why not, was it just the way that the CPR track ran? It was they were told that this was a good place to be? Do you have any idea as to why they seem to find themselves in a bit northern Alberta or more central Alberta rather than southern Alberta? Especially if they were farmers.
Well, my understanding is that the advertisements were for Edmonton or the Edmonton
Mm,
area. The one there in Calgary, there was some that ended up in Calgary, but I mean a lot of them, the people in the people in Calgary, uh, a lot of those people are interrelated to all these people in all these other,
Mm-hmm.
like all those settlements.
hmm
I think Calgary became more settled after the railroad.
Right.
And that's when more people started to move around in Calgary. Because honestly, I mean, other than John Ware, and he wasn't in Calgary, he was south of Calgary.
Yep.
hmm
I don't know that there was any, certainly of our settlers that I know of, that
Yeah.
were farming in the Calgary area.
Yeah. There was like one family, the Lewises, that lived down here and they married into John Ware, like that, their daughter
Yeah,
married John Ware.
yeah.
But they came out from Toronto, so they were already Canadian immigrant. So just Canadians moving across the prairies. So there's kind of almost a different kind of history going on here. It's a slightly later period. They're calling for Americans to come up to settle in the bush country almost.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and some of the Lewises are descendants of, I mean, they
Mhm.
ended up in Edmonton.
Yeah. There's a lot of moving around.
Yeah.
Were people then, I guess, at a certain point, they're moving to places where they can find people who are like them and more? Like we have a lot of block settlement in this area of the world. Is that something that then was happening with the black immigration as well? Is that they're
Um,
going to where they knew people were?
well, I think, as I said, they had in Athabasca anyways, they had the
hmm
scouts.
Right.
And somehow they had word of mouth. So yeah, and again,
hmm
I don't know they, if when immigration came, when
hmm
they got to Immigration Hall, if they, as I said, did they get to pick their land, or did they say, okay,
Yeah.
you guys are all going, we want you all here,
Mm-hmm.
hmm
and we want you all here. And for the Black people that were coming from the States, I'm sure that uh, they didn't mind being out far away from,
Yeah.
because then they could be on their own.
hmm
They didn't have to worry about being lynched and shot, and
Mm-hmm.
you had to worry about bears and coyotes and those kinds of things. But
Totally
and the
fair.
other thing that I've found doing a lot of the research, some of the research that I've done, is moving. They ended up in these areas, but there was other immigrants that came there
Mm.
too.
Yeah.
So like in the area that I was raised in, we were one of the smaller settlements, but some of the neighbors were like German,
hmm
but they had escaped like to Russia or something like that because of what was going on in Germany. Our closest neighbors were, I want to say, we always thought they were German, but it seems to me it had something to do with Austria or someplace that they were
hmm
escaping from.
Wow.
And then sometimes they were born, maybe they were Austrian and then they had to escape across the border. So they just assumed German.
Right.
But we always thought they were German, but they were actually I believe
Hmm.
Austrian or something like that.
Interesting.
But there was, and so in our community, there was a lot of German.
Hmm.
Uh,
Go
Go
ahead,
ahead.
Dom.
Okay. Last year, during February, we did a number of podcasts. One was at Suzette Mayer, who wrote a fictionalized account of a black sleeping car porter.
Mhm.
Won a Giller Prize for excellent book. We talked about farming, and obviously there were a number of sleeping car porters who would find work in that field. What other kind of opportunities did Black people find there, or were they kind of sort of pigeonholed into those couple of different things?
That was the thing. If they weren't farming in a way, the people that lived on the farms, in many ways, it was hard work and everything, but we had, I think, easier lives than the people that ended up in the city, because a
Hmm.
lot of the people in the city had problems finding jobs. My aunt, for example, I mean, she had problems getting into school because they didn't want Black people in the school that she was going, and that was in Campsie. And many of the women worked as domestics.
Hmm.
Now and domestics it's just a housekeeper, but that's what they called them back then. There was back in the mm, mid 50, yeah, 50s, maybe, maybe even earlier 50s. There was a lady here in Edmonton that had a restaurant. So some of the Black younger women and stuff were able to go and work in her restaurant so that they
Hmm.
didn't have to work as domestics. But I can remember, uh, well, my aunt working when and I can't tell you what year it was but I remember she and my uncle, they actually lived in a basement suite, and she was housekeeping for these people,
Hmm.
the Nelsons. She was housekeeping for the Nelsons. And this would have been, well, it must have been in the 60s.
Wow.
And then, but then she finally got a job doing some for a doctor or something,
Hmm.
and he got her into the kitchen at the Misericordia Hospital,
Hmm.
and she ended up getting her journeyman cook license, and that was back when you could do it at like you could work and do
Right.
it. You didn't have to go to
Right.
NAIT or any place. So she
Okay.
managed to get her journeyman cook, and that's what she did, and she retired in the 1980s. But she worked as a domestic.
Wow.
Um, her sisters, one of my dad's sisters, I don't recall that she ever worked out of home. She got married, and her husband was a porter. And I don't think she ever worked out of home. The other one, she did because she was the younger one, and she eventually got a job. She didn't work as a domestic or anything, but she eventually got a job with something to do with the government.
Hmm.
But she had to work in the back office.
Hmm.
Hmm.
She couldn't work on the front or anything. She was in the back doing filing
Right.
or
Right.
something like that. So, and for the men, it was even harder for the men than it was for the women, actually.
Wow.
Well, because it's easier to find a housekeeping job, right?
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But for the men now, um, it was difficult. So some of them worked, on construction, or if you were on the farm and you had, you'd go and help somebody farm or whatever labor work, if you could find
Right.
labor work. Um, but the porters, and actually I have an article here I found about the porters. This is Earl Heslet. He talks about the trains offered steady work, and it was a way to see the count.
Hmm.
It was built as a way for young men to see the country. Being a porter on a passenger train was the only railway job open to a Black man at the time. And he was 85 years old when he did this interview in 2005. And he worked for 40 years on the Canadian National Railroad.
Wow.
He started in 1943 as a porter carrying people's bags and worked his way up to a night car conductor, his last job before retiring 20 years ago. And he said it was hard work, heavy lifting, lots of travel, little sleep, and sometimes having to deal with difficult passengers. But it was steady work.
Wow. So there's fewer opportunities for the men, as you said, and the women had maybe more local opportunities for work.
Yeah, so many of the men did this because it was steady.
Right.
I don't know what the pay was, but it was steady work.
Which is important.
Yeah, and it wasn't easy. Some of them didn't, they were treated badly by, I don't know about the people, by the company, but definitely by a lot of the passengers. You hear some of the stories that they tell they were treated badly. And if they, and I think it's in that Suzette Mare's book. I read it too, where if somebody complained that they docked money off your pay and stuff, I believe that was in that book.
Yep, it certainly was. Yep. Yeah, it didn't paint a very rosy picture of being a sleeping car porter in that early 1900s into where your uncle was there.
Yeah, he said he started in 1943.
Yeah. What else are you working on? What are you researching? What is interesting you right now?
What am I working on now? I probably have my hands in too many pots. I've worked with a couple groups of students from NAIT, and we in April of 2023, we finally finalized and got an updated, really good website. I worked with actually 3 groups of students, and I'm really proud of that. I'm still working my goal would be to do a short film or documentary, but I want to do it on Wildwood and Campsie, and the reason I want to do that is because those are the 2 areas that have been not highlighted as much. Many people know about Amber Valley because of the baseball team. It was, and many people know about Breton because there's a small museum there.
Right.
But Campsie and Wildwood, and actually Wildwood was the largest settlement.
Oh.
I wasn't even really aware of that, but they were the largest of the settlements, and very little has been written or documented about Wildwood. So that's one thing that I'm trying to do is work with these students because I don't know much about Wildwood. In 2005, we actually formed a historical society. So we do have a historical society. We did, it was a research project.
Yeah.
And it was funded by Alberta Heritage Research Council. Yeah. And we interviewed a whole bunch of people, 50 or so at least. So I have about 45 edited, digitized interviews.
Oh, wow.
Of these people. And our criteria at that time was the people had to be 80 plus years old and descendants of these people that came from the States.
Right.
And I was lucky to get so many of them because I'd say now, if I look at my list, the majority of them have passed away.
Yeah.
What kind of stories came out of those recordings, Deborah?
A variety of things. I mean, it was mostly what we had a list of questions and things, but I mean, mostly the project, the title of our project is called In Their Own Words. So, we asked the questions, and it depended on how people they talked about their lives or what they did or their families and it's interesting too that I found that a lot of them didn't dwell on the hardships and things that they went through. I mean, they maybe talked about it, but most of them were just their lives, work and
Wow. Yeah.
um and I didn't just interview Black people in Campsie and in Breton. I also interviewed some of the older white people that
Mm.
like, especially in Campsie, because there was a problem with the school. They didn't want the Black kids going to this one school. And so I did interview 2 or 3 people that were involved in when the new school was built. They all ended up going to the new school.
Mm.
And these were immigrants too, like the one family, I think, I can't remember. They were German.
Hmm.
But they left Germany. I don't know. They ended up in Lethbridge. And then when they ended up in Campsie area, uh, he was telling me about how he was a kid, but he said when the war broke out, he remembers the RCMP coming to their house and taking all their guns.
Mm.
Right.
Mhm. Yeah.
And then one of the other guys that I interviewed, um, he talked about how their family had to change their name.
Right. Sounds like a very interesting community to grow up in and experience with all these kind of different people of immigrant groups.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, my dad was born out. My grandfather came from the state. He was born in I think he was born in Missouri. I some of these places they slip. I think that's where he was born. But his dad, they left North Carolina. And I used to wonder, these people would come and I think, oh, well, Granny was born in Alabama and Uncle Reese was born in someplace else. But it's because they were moving across the country and these kids
Yeah.
were born in all these different
Yeah.
places.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us greatly. We know that you have lots of people asking to talk to you at this time of year, especially. So,
Well, it's quieter this year. That's fine with me, actually.
Well, Deborah, thanks for doing this. We really, really appreciate it.
Okay.
thank you.